Um, Hegel, in his Encyclopedia of Philosophy, makes a point that when we look at an inquiry, a philosophical inquiry, we want to ask, where does it begin? That this is a very important thing. And with Hegel, unlike the other sciences, philosophy begins with the subject of philosophizing, the person. And the goal of philosophizing for Hegel is to bring the philosopher as finite spirit into the identity with God as the object of pure thinking. And in his critique of Kantian formalism, he wants to see the identities of persons as emerging from the structures of community, family and community. And so this, for me, is, there's two sides to this. One of them is a conception of person that is a social construct. And secondly, the idea that we have to pay attention to interpretive context. Sung Moon really is upfront in his book about being a political theorist as opposed to a political philosopher, where he really wants to make the point. And I think that in making that point, he addresses some of the issues that Ellie brought up, you know, about theory fragmenting, where Sung Moon is really saying that a political theorist has to be responsible to the social and historical conditions. And I think that not only is that right, but it is consistent with the worldview of the Mengzi and the Xunzie in terms of their understanding of theory, where theory is not something that stands independent of practice, but rather that theory emerges out of the social and historical conditions in order to try to make them more intelligent, more productive. And so that that understanding of what the project is, I think, is very important. The one issue that I really want to focus on, and it really has implications, is Sung Moon says if we analytically disentangle Li's instrumental dimension from its intrinsic moral dimension, what fresh light can it shed on the political philosophies of Mencius and Xunzie? And so he has this kind of a dichotomy between Li as an instrument for cultivating personal, social, and political order, what he calls, I think he's using Sorhun Tan's language when he says a role-enabling semiotic structure. So this is the way that Li functions as a social grammar to produce the poesy of the human experience. And he wants to make a distinction between that and Li as a heavenly endowed virtue, a given and intrinsic character trait. And so in his language, a virtue that is constituent of formidable moral character. And so you have this kind of contrast between the person with virtue and the social function. And I would really think about this in terms of Ti Yong, actually. And so his resolution to the problem, to this dichotomy, is what he calls virtue monism, where he sort of solves the problem on both sides. He solves the problem for Sorhun and other Confucian role ethicists who would claim community is constituted of persons by collapsing the intrinsic moral dimension into its instrumental dimension. And in so doing, asserting that, and this is Sung Moon's language, there is no moral virtue independent of one's social positions or roles in the community as such, as there are no humans, hence human excellence or flourishing, separate from one's social identities. Okay, so so the virtue issue goes away, and we simply have person within family and community in the roles that are defining of them. For the perfectionist Republican, the virtue ethicists, for whom the standing of persons in the community is grounded in their personal excellence, virtue monism solves the same problem by doing the opposite, and that is collapsing the instrumental dimension into the intrinsic moral dimension in asserting, as Sung Moon says, there can be no civic virtue without being personally good. You need good people, and then you get civic virtue. Sung Moon frames what are truly illuminating distinctions. And this, again, I think this kind of speaks to Yong Sun's worry about categories. What Sung Moon is saying is that these distinctions are a matter of emphasis rather than exclusive categories. And so he's sort of, I think that that's the best way to go about it. Now, in appreciating the synoptic distinction between the virtue political theory that can be derived from the strong virtue monism, Mencius, and the tempered monism, Xunziye, Kim is able to establish a non-exclusive yet functional contrast between Mencius's virtue constitutionalism and Xunziye's ritual constitutionalism. And so I think that non-exclusive and functional qualification that he makes is really important for us to register in terms of the sophistication of his presentation. And he goes on, the goal set by Mencius is the ethical spiritual or ethical religious self-transformation of persons through experiencing a cosmic unity with heaven by realizing their endowed nature. So this is the virtue side. The goal set by Xunziye is their ethical political transformation into civil persons that has redirected their natural commitment to self-interest into a socially and politically redeeming motive force. And so this is the civic virtue. Now, while Sung Moon, with his virtue monism, tries to reconcile the contrasting interpretations of how Li functions to effect political order, he has found common cause with the perfectionist Republican, with the virtue ethicists, who take heaven as a cosmic bastion of morals that endows human beings with an innate moral nature, with the corollary being that, and his language, Confucian ritual practices such as mourning rites are possible only after man's self-awakening in the voice of innate morality or heaven's decree. It is not so much the socio-political institutions of Li, allegedly created by the Sage Kings, but the innate sense of ritual propriety and its arduous social practice that really matter in enabling man to become a true human being. So what I want to do is I want to accuse Sung Moon of being a virtue ethicist, and I want to allow that he is a self-confessed virtue ethicist. This is he's putting it up front. He's saying, this is what I'm doing. And so now we go to me. And as my starting point, Hegel, I want to posit a contrast between a classical Greek ontological conception of human beings, where we have that idea of moral virtue, and a classical I Ching, or a Book of Changes process conception of what I will call human becomings, a contrast between ontology as the science of being per se that gives us human beings, and what I will call zootology, Shang Lun, as the art of living, a contrast between a human being as a noun and human becomings as gerunds. And I want to try to win political theorist Sung Moon over to the dark side, called Confucian role ethics, by arguing that it is a holistic narrative understanding of persons as human becomings that is best able to reconcile the erstwhile distinction between Li as a moral virtue and Li as an achieved civic virtuosity. So important to an understanding of this vocabulary is the Gestalt shift from the Greek noun-dominated thinking with its world of human beings and essential things to the Confucian derondative assumptions about the always eventful nature of human becomings living their lives within their natural ecology. It's the difference between a leg and walking. Dewey abjures what he calls the philosophical fallacy. In doing that, he makes this same point in alerting us to our inveterate habit of decontextualizing and essentializing one element within the continuity of experience, and then in our best efforts to overcome this post hoc diremption of then construing the same element as foundational and causal. As a concrete example of this habit, we achieve virtuosity in the process of our ongoing conduct. We achieve virtuosity in the process of our ongoing conduct by abstracting something called virtue out of the complexity of this continuing experience, and then making the abstraction antecedent to and causal of the process itself, hence the virtue ethicist. For Dewey, the reality is the growth process itself. The real existence is a history in its entirety. The history just is what it is. The operations of splitting it up into two parts, the moral virtue and the li as the social grammar, and then having to unite them again by appeal to causative power, are equally arbitrary and gratuitous. So a passage in the Analects that perhaps best expresses Confucian political philosophy claims that, and we all know this passage, if you lead the people with policy and effect social order with punishments, they will avoid wrongdoing, but will not develop an appropriate sense of shame. If you lead the people by modeling virtuosity in their conduct and effect social order in your conduct, effect social order by encouraging propriety in roles and relations, the people will not only develop a sense of shame, but will also order themselves. And that will also order themselves, I think, is really important. So how does this, this role ethics answer some of the questions that Sung Moon poses? His question, do rulers and ruled have the same virtues? It is synergy among several interpenetrating factors, the moral virtuosity displayed in the role modeling of rulers, the proper functioning of familial and social roles, and the commensurate sense of shame that develops within ritually choreographed family and community relations that serve constitutionally to effect social and political order. So it's the constitution, this kind of isomorphism between family and polity that really goes unspoken in Sung Moon's book. That this is one, if I were to make a criticism, I think that this isomorphism is really a key element in the way in which we ought to theorize Mencius and Xunziye on role politics. These Confucian texts give primacy to the thick notion of achieving propriety in one's lived roles and relations as its main criteria for effecting social and political order, and as such, must take the relevant specific interests of all parties into account, that is, ruled as well as rulers. So Sung Moon's question, in Confucian Wu-Wei statecraft, does the moral charisma of the ruler draw the people into compliance, or is the need for governance that would correct the people negated by the fact that everyone can become more or less good by realizing their heavenly endowed nature? Again, that kind of a dichotomy. Such a focus and field account of the social and political family would mean that their differences are implicated in each other and that the quality of each is dependent upon the quality of the relationship with the other. In what we might call a Confucian role politics, virtuosic constitutionalism and its achieved civility allows rulers and ruled to live their different roles symbiotically and without coercion. Hence the idea that with the proper kind of moral education, where it is a consensus among the people that constitutes the constitutional remedy, not law but li, where it's the li that are more robust than attenuated. You have a model of effecting social and political order that reflects this kind of holistic narrative way of understanding human beings in a community, human beings in polity. So I will end my slideshow there.
Thank you so much, Roger.